Hi folks, I'm International Master John Watson, and this is Ask the Master on ICC TV. Happy holidays, Happy New Year, another day, another dollar, or another 365 days, another $365. This is a new start for this show, and the main idea of this show is to provide you and the viewers or anybody in the chess world a chance to ask questions about chess and various chess topics. You can send these questions in advance, and really the best way to do that is to email me at askimwatson@chessclub.com. That's ASKIMWATSON at chessclub.com. You can also send a question to my ICC. If you're an ICC member, you can message me at John L. Watson. That's JOHNLWATSON. You can make comments below when you see this on the YouTube channel afterwards, when it's archived, you can make comments below and ask questions below that. Right now, the last way to do it, and a very popular way, is to ask questions live in the chat box on YouTube, where some of you are. I see, I just looked over there for the first time. We have Shidki and Haya and Immortal Wazir. Oh, fantastic. Okay. So you can ask questions there, and questions can be about anything really. We do a lot of opening things. I show games. You can send me games, for example, by email, and we're going to do one of those right away, actually. I'm trying to catch up on the last couple of weeks, so I won't be looking at the chat quite as much as usual, because I've got a bunch of questions to catch up on. But you can ask about anything. You can ask about chess books, chess videos, chess history, what's going on in the world of chess right now. You can even make comments. You don't even have to ask questions. You can talk about how you like some player or another, or something you've noticed about the chess world or chess. So you can ask about endgames, middle games, strategy, all these things. Okay, so I think without further ado, I'm going to just zoom ahead here. We've got a game this week. I haven't shown a game in a little while, so I've got a game from Tom Weisman, and he says, I'm black in the game attached, and my opponent starts to move all his pawns very aggressively and without developing. Whenever someone plays like this against me, I know it must not be good, but I always get a cramped position and my opponent gets an attack. I know I should open up the center and lines towards the king and should target the pawns that are somehow overextended, but sometimes there doesn't seem to be a way to do this, or I can't find it. And this is a blitz game, so it's not some perfect game or something like that. He's just showing you it's an example of the style of play and that he has problems against, so he'd like to see my comments on how to deal with this type of play. I thought it was a good game to send me because that's a typical question I get, and I think a lot of people have this problem, that when the pawns just come rolling away. Okay, now, white, obviously it's not a regular opening. Tom is black, and he gets his pieces out. See, he's already got two pieces out developed, the knight on c6 and the bishop on f5. White doesn't have any out. White finally brings one out, but then makes more pawn moves. And black is just developing naturally. It almost can't be bad what black's doing. He's just bringing his pieces out. And white starts advancing his pawns like crazy on the king's side. Now there's a threat to trap the bishop. So black stops that, very good, and threatens maybe to take here in some cases. So white pushes and black goes back. So black's still ahead by two pieces in development and has really his share of the center. Not a bad center at all. So black should be just fine here. And white makes yet another pawn move, and this is a funny pawn move because it doesn't really threaten f5 if you think about it. It does stop e5 for black. That's the main point of it, but it gives black a big outpost there and a very nice square on f5 where nothing can attack it. Before, if you put something on f5, there might be an e4 move with tempo if you put a piece there, and you couldn't put a piece on e4, but now you couldn't put a piece there, but now you can put a piece there. So that move's probably not very good. And it's all pawn moves. So that's why this question is relevant, because he's saying, look, the guy's making all pawn moves, not bringing out his pieces. I keep bringing out my pieces, but what's going on here? I seem to get bad games when my opponent plays this way. Okay, well, now one thing white does have is space, and space is very important in chess. So it's not as though white has no advantages at all. And sometimes when you have space, you just gain space and do nothing else, it's kind of okay because black isn't able to do anything about your space advantage, and then you can catch up in development. And because you have space, you don't have to worry about getting checkmated or anything like that. Get all your pieces out, and once you've caught up in development, you just have a simple space advantage. That's the danger. There are openings where that happens. Most of the time, though, if white makes this many pawn moves, there's some problem. Even here, for example, before bishop d6, You can look for, what are you going to do about something like this? Well, you want to make pawn breaks. It's hard to make this pawn break, but you want to open up some lines. You're ahead in development, so you want to open up some lines and get to his position. Central if possible, for example, would be f6 and e5, but anything that gets more of your pawns off the last rank and attacks his center is going to be useful. And that's one reason why this is a very good move. It has the idea of putting the knight there on that very powerful, it's almost like an outpost square, because if white advances, he creates even more weaknesses, and prepares the move c5. And that's very hard to stop. I mean, you could play b4, but then a5, this all of a sudden happens. And this point is getting weak, and if he goes there, then you play c5 anyway. Now you're going to have a square for your rook. Notice white doesn't have any open files. You're going to have an open file. And you can put the knight here, and you put the queen out here, put pressure on this square. You'll find that this is very easy to play. So this is one approach you could take. And almost anybody, including engines, would say that black's quite a bit better there. So really, white wasn't justified in pushing all these pawns. But what you did is fine. The other thing you could do, for example, is just here to stop b4, which is, you have to realize that b4 grabs more space, and then move the knight, and then play c5, or play even a4 and move the knight and play for c5. There are other ways to play this, but the basic point is get your pawns going and attack his center. And that might mean moving this knight. I think that's one way to think about it. Okay, so white plays b4, another pawn move, just too many pawn moves, and black plays the other possible break, so that's good. So Tom understood how to approach this position, which is move your pawns and open up some lines. You might end up taking this, but you might also just play this e5 move, which would really start breaking open in the center and open lines for black's pieces, because he's way ahead in development. Okay, let's just see how this works out. Another pawn move. This is completely crazy. It does gain more space, but space by itself without development is very dangerous. Now here, I don't like this move much at all, because it does open up one of his pieces, and it just doesn't help that much. It means that actually that h4 pawn becomes a bit of a target. Nevertheless, black's still better after that move. Maybe easier though would be to play the knight back like we talked about, and put a knight on this very powerful square. Maybe put a bishop up here somewhere, like here or here, and then play e5. You might even be able to play e5 right away. I haven't really looked at this carefully. You want to watch out for the tactics, but it's probably black is probably better here. Maybe that was the best move, actually. Threatens to win a pawn, opens up lines. I find it very hard to believe black isn't better here. So basically, that's the answer to the question: is, get things going, move these pawns fast, and you did that pretty much. But taking is maybe a bad way to start, because for one thing, now you can't play e5. Maybe that's the main problem with taking, is now e5 is at the cost of, now you can't retake with a pawn on e5. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Queen e7, again, I think knight e7, because you want to get c5 in, a5 and c5. Another pawn move for white. White has only gotten one piece out. That's a very bad sign. White should play this move, and then white might be pretty well, decently okay in this position. He'd be sort of stand okay. But this move is just too slow, because now black can do something that's also very typical when you're way, way ahead in development, which is you can even afford to give up a piece just to get open lines. So that would be a very strong move now. It's not obvious, but once you get used to these positions, it is pretty obvious. You just start taking things. You get 2 pawns for a piece right off the bat, and more importantly, you're attacking this, you're attacking this, you're going to have open files against the king. You're also threatening queen g3 check. And this is just pretty much a winning position. Now, it's not easy to play those. When you haven't played a lot of chess, you might not see that right away. You might think that's risky, but it really isn't very risky. I think the best thing white can try is that, to stop queen g3 check, and then black just castles. Look at that nice open file. Down on that f file, this move is probably best. And if check, for example, here. But now black has 3 pawns for his piece, which already is just about enough. Actually, I'm wrong about that. He only has 2 pawns for the piece, but that's something. And now maybe a move like this, threatening bishop takes. And basically what's going on here is that white's running out of ideas, and black's going to have the better game here, regardless here. So, just for example, I don't know, maybe you can't play rook b1 because the bishop's covering that. Maybe he has to give him a 3rd pawn, something like this, and then just take this, and then play knight here. And now you got pressure this way. You have the knight coming in to these squares, and black's much, much better here. Maybe not quite as much better as he was earlier, but something like that. Okay, so how did the game go? The game went like this, and that was a problem for a couple reasons. One thing is that became a target, and also it's not a developing move or a pawn break move. So really you're looking for developing and pawn break moves. White goes there attacking this, and eventually, and black really has to give it up. So he's a pawn down now. On the other hand, black's still way ahead in development, should stand just fine here. But whether he has an advantage anymore, that's a different thing. Because now there's no more e5 break. So black needs a pawn break still, and he still doesn't have one. Maybe white's better by now. I'm not sure, actually, but because black is still very well developed, I think white's actually doing well now. He tries to break open the A file, but he attacks this knight. Now I think the knight just needs to go there. It's a pretty good square. It covers that important square there. It's fairly aggressive, but the knight went the other way. Unfortunately, because this was a blitz game, white played. Now white's much better because black's pieces really aren't doing anything. But fortunately, white started messing up here. I don't remember exactly where. Now that's a nice move because it threatens rook takes. So at least we're getting a little bit of a counterattack here. And white played that, and that's just a mistake because it takes the it allows this penetration by black with the check, sort of typical blitz game move. And it's going to waste time with the knight because after queen comes here, the knight's going to have to move again. So all of a sudden, black's pieces are super active, and now black's pretty much winning because queen h5 is a big move too. White's just completely tied down here. So now again, this is threatened, and this can't move to defend it. So white has to play there, which is quite sad. And black brings his last piece. So black's playing this very well. Black's bringing his last piece into play. It's a blitz game, so naturally not everything is perfect for either side. And there, and all of a sudden black's threatening knight h4, and there's no answer because everything's just tied up. It's all tied up. Look at these bishops. They're still back on original squares, and it's just a big mess. So white tries to do this, but it loses material to this sequence, and black was just a piece up, and I won't give the rest of it. But and there are times where I can get away with making a ton of pawn moves in the opening, but usually the answer is to try to break with pawn moves to counterattack. One example of this is this fairly well-known line in the French, for example, where white just keeps trying to take over the center with pawns, and black just keeps developing pieces, this kind of thing. And what often happens in positions like this is white doesn't allow any kind of breakdown of the center, but he does allow some sort of breakthrough of the, I mean, I'm just going to make not very good moves, maybe sort of random moves, but he does allow, the fact that white's so far behind in development means that black can play things like sacrificing on this square. Like white can't castle because black can take this, but if white makes a neutral move, maybe I should have left that there and castled. But if white makes a sort of neutral move, I don't know, like this or something, then all of a sudden everything kind of falls apart because there'll be a piece sacrifice here. Tends to work anyway. Doesn't always work, but usually tends to work. So sometimes you're so far ahead in development that you can afford to just give up a piece. But if you can't give up a piece and you can't break down the center, then the person who's moving all the pawns forward actually stands better. So it's a trade-off kind of thing. All right, so that was, maybe I took a little too long on that, but I thought it was an instructive game and a good question. Okay, so we're getting some questions here. I'm going to do a little less of the chat than usual, but because I want to get to several things I promised people I would, things they sent me. Is there any chance for a 1400 player who is 18 to become a GM? Well, these days I'd say yes, because I think that if you work hard and study hard, if you're, you can, but you would have to play chess a lot and study chess a lot, and the only reason there's maybe a chance to become a GM at an older age now, I mean 18 is hardly old, is that there's so many tournaments where there are norm possibilities and chances to play other grandmasters. You have to be able to travel probably. You want to be able to play in Europe, play a lot of FIDE tournaments in the United States if you live there. So you can theoretically do it. I'd say there's a chance. It's of course very difficult. Chess tends to be dominated now by these young people becoming GMs at a very early age, but I wouldn't give up on the possibility completely. I certainly doubt if you're going to become world champion. That one I think we can say you have to start awfully early. It's like a lot of sports where you have to start awfully early to be the very best. Okay, thanks for paying attention to stuff. Okay, I'm reading the chat now. John, do you think that the immortal game of Yi, considered the game of the century, was preparation? If it was, do you think it is less impressive? As I recall, most of it was not preparation. The key combinational part, I don't believe, could have been preparation. I don't think. I think it's too far into the game. I don't guarantee that. It's a wonderful game. I don't know if it's really the game of the century, but it's a very, very nice game and really fun. And I think the one reason it might not be the game of the century, I'm just guessing, but it may not be the completely accurate. Like every move isn't perfect, and that can keep it from being, from being maybe that praiseworthy in the highest sense. But obviously, it's a wonderful, wonderful game, and he's played quite a few great combinations. So I'm hoping he does well. He's in a bit of a lull right now, but of course he's super young. Samish King's Indian is a very good multi-pawn space example, and in fact, I don't think I'll show it, but yeah, what happens in the Samish King's Indian is a lot of times black has to break through with moves like b5, giving up a pawn. Sometimes there's even piece sacrifices, just to make sure that pawn center gets broken up. Excellent example. Come on, folks, we're in a friendly place here. Nice by black. Whoops. Nice by black. Yeah, nice game. Mr. Watson, what's your take on the knight a6 line in the main line of the King's Indian for black? I've won a bunch of games with knight a6 instead of the most common knight c6. I'll tell you what, I'll get right back to that, and I'll show you something else from last week. Let me do this, because otherwise I'll never get to everything that I've kind of been promising, and also things that people have sent. But this is something someone mentioned last week that might bring back some nostalgia for Bobby Fischer fans. This opening, we talked about this, and white playing this move, which is considered a little inaccurate. White probably should play this first, or some other move, because after this move, black plays this move, f6. That's what Fischer played against Petrosian, and maybe black's already a little better, which is really funny, speaking of pawn moves versus piece moves. But the main point is that d4, which is natural to stop e5, forces a piece to this square, and when there's a piece there, you get e5 in anyway, and white just has much better center. Black has much better center and has the better game. So there are options here. White, for example, can play there now, but one thing that can happen in a position like this is this kind of thing, with this kind of pawn structure for black. And there's a case where black has no pieces developed, but white has no way to break down the center convincingly. For example, this might follow, something like this. And it just turns out, now here's an example where there aren't any available pawn breaks that really break up black's center, so black actually stands better. There's no way to sacrifice a piece here that works, and it just turns out, of course, it's not much better. White's still okay here, but he is white, and he shouldn't really stand worse this early in the game. So that's the point of this f6 move, which we talked about last week, and I just wanted to show you sort of why that worked and what it was. And then one other thing here, which was what happens here. I was thinking about this. I don't see any games. This is kind of interesting, I think. Maybe you'll disagree with this. I think that's an interesting move, just getting one more piece out. And one of the ideas is maybe you're going to even play this move, e4. And then if he plays d4, you're going to play check with the bishop and bring that back, and you're already ready to castle. And if you get enough pieces out, then you can break with either f4 or c3. Let me show you that. Let's say he plays e5 right away, which most people would. Well, okay, let's say e5 right away. There's other moves, but here, for example, this move is interesting. And the idea here is you're letting him get this huge, huge, wonderful lead in space and the center, but you've got a nice little outpost there, and if he attacks it, you can always defend it with bishop c4 and castles, and then you can start breaking up this center. And maybe you can move this knight and then play f4. So it's the one reason I showed this is because this is the thing we got in our first game. It's the same kind of question. One side's just pushing pawns, the other side's, and by the way, that's like a Samish King's Indian, which we were just asked about. Black is playing the white side of a Samish, kind of. So anyway, things like that. Now maybe black would play here to be a little more cautious, and then and also you might say, why not just d4? But then he kind of overextending that center a little bit. That's attacked, and e3 e3 can come next. Something like this, for example. And now there's ideas of bishop c4, stopping black from castling. If black stops that, there's bishop b5 check, followed by capturing here, followed by castling, maybe put a rook on e1. There's plenty of counterplay here for white. I don't know if white's better, but it's at least, probably is actually, but it's at least a fun way to play. So that would be if d4. And if knight c6, which is probably the best move, I think, then here, then again, this kind of move bishop here can be quite a move. So I actually found a game with this, and someone played, because if you play here, we've still got this problem of the knight coming into d5. And if he plays e6, I think the guy went e6. And anyway, eventually this came out to be about even, but you can see that white has a lot of development. And in fact, can even just go like this, because when you've got this many pieces out, you can always organize a d4 and an f4 later. So anyway, just want to show you that bishop that f6 idea and why it's good for black, but also maybe some idea for white. So in this game, he played more conventionally with e3 and then check. And the problem, as I just showed you before, is this move. This is a problem. After that, the knight has to go somewhere, and then f5 protects the center. So the pawns win this time instead of the pieces. So you can never tell for sure who's going to win what here. So instead of that, I was looking at this line. There's a couple games with this position. And I think black's fine here, because white doesn't really have any really good pawn breaks. I think white's best idea is to play here now, and then take and open some lines. And this is maybe now here with the idea of b4, and then here. It's like a Benoni defense, but that bishop's not really very well placed. But this is playable for white, but it's also fine for black. So he can also take. That's what he did in the game. He took and drove the knight back, and that was fine too for black, but it's a little riskier. You can see that because now this center's a little bit exposed. So this happened. He was attacking that, so he defended it. Now maybe he's thinking about queen takes d2. So white tries to break in the center and brings the queen out, and I guess this position's considered about equal in the game, the person giving notes here. Because black's got more space, but white has some pressure against the center. The king's a little vulnerable on the queen side. It's just a game. This is a very nice bishop. It's a nice game. Okay, so I just want to show you that. Let me see. What's your take on knight a6 in the main line? Let's just do that first. Let's go in order. He's talking about the King's Indian defense with knight a6, which I not only play, I sometimes teach this, and I also know some other people who play it, some stronger players than I am that play this. I think it's a pretty reasonable line. You can play knight a6 right away, or you can play e5 first and then knight a6. I tend to think knight a6 right away is even slightly better move order, possibly. But anyway, that's sort of the basic position. And he says, what's your take? Well, I guess for most people you want to know maybe what the idea is. And the idea is that, first of all, it's handy if white ever takes this. It plays some sort of exchange version, because that square is covered. You may say, what's that about? Well, what that's about is that moves like knight d5 and knight b5 can be dangerous otherwise. It's a little awkward to defend that square, but not in this line, because the knight's already defending it. So white here usually plays more conventionally, either bishop e3, that's the most popular move, or rook e1. And why would black want his knight here instead of here? Well, first of all, he can't be attacked with tempo. You know, if you play that main line, this big main King's Indian line, you're going to a square that may not have that many prospects immediately of much action. It's kind of a funny square, e7 for the knight. Maybe not all that great sometimes. And on top of that, you've taken 2 moves to get there. Whereas if you play the knight out here, then you don't have to worry about losing time with it now. But you might say, well, it's on the side of the board. What the heck good can it do? Well, one thing it can do is that if this ever gets taken or this is ever pushed, the knight has that very nice little square there to go to. Attacking here, by the way. In fact, that's one of the main lines. That's probably the third main move that white can play. It can also come from the knight bd7 line. So, and the other idea is that even if the pawn sits there, there's the possibility of taking. Let's say white made a really slow move, something like this. Well, black could just develop here or play a move like this, but he could also take and start playing in the center against that square and probably do pretty well here, or reasonably well. I probably wouldn't take immediately, but just to show you the basic position. And you might think about trying to play for f5 now. I probably wouldn't take on d4 that fast, but you might. You can. You can also play maybe this first. But the point is that there's a good square sitting there, whether white advances or whether white takes or whether white just sits there. So just for example, well, I don't know if I need to give an example, but that's the point of playing the knight to a6 instead of c6. And also it leaves the bishop open. For example, if you play knight bd7, which is an old move that people used to play all the time, I played a lot of games with this. I actually won some nice games with black, but it does cut the bishop out. So for example, some line like, here's a line where white plays here. A lot of times black likes to play this move now. That's a good move now to play. which you couldn't play if your knight was here. So that's not much of an answer, but I would say I trust knight a6. Good players still play it. Maybe white gets a slight advantage if he plays perfectly, but that's kind of typical of the King's Indian anyway. Okay, how about chess coaching to supplement book and video study? So many good options. Seek similar style, how to wade through all the choices. Do you mean choices of chess coaches? Yeah, it looks like you do. I would say chess coaching can be very useful for certain kinds of players because, well, a couple things. One thing is you can ask questions, like you can on this show, but directly. What do I do here? What did I do wrong in this game? Look at these 100 games of mine. What am I doing wrong? It's a lot easier for an outsider, especially a strong player, to see what you're doing wrong than it is for you yourself to see what you're doing wrong. There's a tendency in your own games to go, oh, if I just not dropped that piece, I would have won, and so therefore I don't have to worry about what happened in this game. But the reality is that it's kind of a whole package, and even small mistakes that you're making are important for your overall results. Seek a similar style? No, I don't think so. I think any decent, if you get someone who's 300 or 400 points stronger than you are, you're probably okay with any. The style isn't going to be that important because any good teacher can work with any kind of position and or any kind of approach to the game. How to wade through all the choices? That's different. The choices are on various websites. Probably you're talking about. So it kind of depends which sites you're on. I'm prejudiced, but I think it's nice to have someone who. This may be not a great thing to say because I don't want to be prejudiced against particular types of coaches, but I think it's nice if you're comfortable with the person's language abilities and communication skills. I've seen that be a problem where people will get coaches that are pretty strong players, but they're English, and in my case it's usually English that we're worried about. The students have problems with the English and the subtlety, the fine tuning of the teacher's communication, linguistic skills. So that can be, watch out for that a little bit. Try somebody once, but if, don't feel wedded to them if you're having trouble understanding them. That can happen. What else can be a problem with a teacher? I mean, if you can find somebody, find out if they do good preparation. Make sure they go over your games before they talk to you in the lesson. I would say stay away from teachers who all they do is you show them some games and they say what they think is going on. That's very easy for any strong player to do, and it's probably not as useful as someone who's going to put a little bit of time to thinking about your style and your weaknesses and your strengths. Okay, John, do you know any good material on the bishop f4, the queen's gambit decline from black's point of view? Yeah, I guess any queen's gambit declined books. It's a really good question because there's a lot from white's point of view, isn't there, Haya? There's DVDs and books and repertoires all over the place. From black's point of view, I have to think about that. There are a fair number of videos on playing the black side of the queen's gambit declined, so that's something to look into. So let's talk about what we're doing here. We're talking about the queen's gambit decline. There's various move orders you can get to. One of the common bishop f4, one of the common repertoire choices for black is to play this first before knight here, precisely so that white will play bishop f4 instead of bishop g5. So in other words, so that when white plays, white commits to knight f3, and then maybe white will prefer to play that. Maybe bishop g5 is something the people are most worried about. Let me be more specific there. A lot of times, in case everybody doesn't already know this, a lot of times people are a little afraid of white taking here first and then playing bishop g5. So they play bishop e7 on the third move. Almost every famous player, it seems to me, did this. Alatortsev variation, it's called, but Karpov, Spassky, almost every queen's gambit decline player has used this move order at least some of the time. Aronian, everybody today, a lot of people use this. And one of the reasons is they kind of want you to play bishop f4 instead of bishop g5. If you play bishop g5 now, it's not as good because you didn't have a chance to transpose into this variation. So bishop f4 is very popular. So that's what we're talking about. And the question is, what do we do about this variation? And usually black castles. So what do we do about this position as black? Who talks about this? And I think many books which give repertoires for black in the queen's gambit decline will talk about this. The problem is there aren't that many recent books that are doing that. And I'm trying to think. There are some videos that have been out recently about playing the queen's gambit decline as black. So you might want to do some web searches on that. I could also listen to some suggestions if someone knows any books or videos out there. The funny thing is the Queen's Gambit Declined is a very professional opening, and top players use it constantly, but I would say that not that many lower players, it's not something that is fun to write about, because white has a lot of options and black has a little bit of a cramped game. So on a professional level, that's just fine. I mean, if you can draw as black, you're totally happy. But on a amateur level, I think it's maybe not a big bestseller. But most of the time, black would like to play something a little more dynamic. And even within the Queen's Gambit, it's more fun to play things like the Vienna or something. You know, to play like things like, I don't know, these kinds of things, or Rogozins maybe after Bishop G5. You know, a little more dynamic sort of thing to play, you know, this kind of thing. Or you know, the Rogozin variation, for example, or even Queen's Gambit Accepted. And so maybe that's why you don't see that many books from black's point of view in the Queen's Gambit Declined. And I know I'm missing some, and I know there are some. If we have anybody online who knows some, you can do some Google searching. That might work pretty well. But it's a very good question. Most of them are from white's point of view, which is probably why you're frustrated. Now you can always play over things. Look at in ChessBase. Just go over what the top players play against the Bishop F4 lines. Just check those out. If you get the website Chess Publishing, that's fantastic. It's got annotated game after annotated game and all kinds of things that would make a complete repertoire. Okay, let me. Yes, it's a time thing. The reason people don't become titled after age 20 or something is that you don't get to dedicate the amount of time that a 12-year-old would be able to. That's absolutely true. Absolutely true. Most people don't. I'm assuming this person has a lot of time. I don't know why. Maybe independently wealthy or something. I don't know. It's pretty tough. You definitely have to put the hours in. Put a knight out where it is vulnerable. Not Samish, wrong, fiend, shadow, cosine. Yeah, it's true. It's not. It's a Samish pawn structure. Yeah, he's talking about that thing I was talking about with F6. That I was just trying to make the analogy between the game we showed at the beginning with the big center, and then someone had mentioned the Samish variation as being an example where white gets this big center, but it takes many pawn moves to get there. And so, in other words, that this was Samish-like in that sense. You know, that something like this is Samish-like in the sense of this. In fact, I showed this move C4, and I was talking about this, and that's very. It's as if it's not a Samish at all because we aren't playing a King's Indian as white, but it's the same pawn structure. Just wanted to mention that. And so someone asked about white playing the Samish being a good example, and I said yes, it's a great example. And this really is the Samish. Here's the Samish proper. But it's the same pawn structure, and it has the idea in it about playing with a lot of pawn moves for white. Right, a lot of pawn moves, and then maybe even some more pawn moves later. But anyway, that kind of thing, for example. So black has development, and black has certain active alternatives, but white has space. So that's the trade-off. Oh, wow, look at this. What's wrong with the knight? Takes e5 seconds, F6 lines. Yeah, I think it turns out you just don't get enough for the piece. I don't think I'll show that again because we already spent some time on that. Maybe next week. Thank you, Alan. Good. It's a good question. Just doesn't seem to give you quite enough. Jordan Crouch, JW, when is the best time for a caveman attack? It just varies from position to position. If you have a nice lead in development and control of the center, you can usually do a flank attack. Is the idea. H4, H5, H6. He's asking when can you attack. First of all, you probably don't want to do a caveman attack unless black's played G6. So he's talking about basically when can we play H4, H5 against a G6 structure. And I would say the rule of thumb is if you have a good strong center and you aren't falling apart in the center, that might give you time to play H4, H5. But if not, you'll probably get killed in the center before your caveman attack succeeds. Under what circumstances is C5 appropriate? Now that might be from an earlier position we were looking at. Probably is. You might want to repeat that, Eric, in the context of the position. Okay, the Grandmaster Repertoire book series has all D4 openings, yes. I've written several books on the Tarrasch, including the Schar. Yes, Eric Schiller, who's on right now, a very famous author and player, and arbiter, international arbiter and linguist, has written many chess books, and several of them were about the Tarrasch variation he's mentioning, which is, but specifically the Hennig-Schara gambit. Which okay, now this is the Albin counter gambit. Remember, we've actually talked a fair amount in this lecture about that. But the Tarrasch goes c5 first. And if white plays this move, then black usually takes, but there is this option of playing captures here, and that's called the Hennig-Schara gambit. And Eric has written extensively about this. One of the ideas is that if white plays queen takes, sometimes they check first, but if white plays queen takes, this knight move attacks the queen and white can't take it because the pawn's pinned. So black starts gaining a lot of time. And if white comes back, if white tries to come, well, I don't know if we should analyze this, but basically black gets a nice big lead in development. For example, if that move is played, this is one of the moves you can play. Because black's, even though the queens are off, black's threatening knight b4, maybe knight here, and has a really nice attacking chances, is the idea. I won't go any deeper than that, but that's called the Hennig-Schara gambit, and you can get Eric's books on those, and it's quite a reason. If you're going to play gambits, it's one of the most fun, especially as black. Okay, now the Scandinavian with no e takes d5 on move 2, like knight c3. I like d4, but not really covered in the books. Okay, we can take a quick look at that. Scandinavian, and then I'm going to show you that dragon stuff that I've been threatening to show you for quite a while. I'm trying to make sure I go quickly here because I don't want to skip another week without showing you that. Okay, this is called the Scandinavian defense for black. And usually black either takes here, and after knight c3 he loses time, but he's fairly happy to lose time. He can go to any of these squares, as it turns out. And they're all fairly legitimate. But he's saying instead of playing e takes d5, and the other move you can make is this, and then take this. Because if white defends that, you can get a very nice counterattack going with that move. So let me see, what else was I going to say there? Or e6, by the way, I think is also a legitimate way to play. But what he's saying is what happens if you don't take? Well, if you don't take, you aren't gaining any time. So he's mentioning knight c3. Let me see. And that's a playable move. What that is a one knight c3 opening, where after he plays d5, white plays the rather popular move e4. The problem with, of course, all these openings is you aren't going to get an advantage, but you are worse here. You're perfectly fine here. And black has a bunch of options. Black can play a Caro-Kann, for one thing. That's a type of Caro-Kann. Black can play a French. This is a legitimate, normal kind of French with two knights c3, and sometimes white plays there, and other times he transposes by playing d4. Black can also play d4, obviously. Let's get to that in a second. But he can also take, just clearing out the center. And this is one of the key positions. And then black has all kinds of options, like bringing the knight here and the knight here. He can even get a Caro-Kann-like position with c6 at some point. e5 is a completely legitimate move, and knight c6 is another legitimate move. So there's actually quite a lot of theory of this move, even though this position, even though it isn't considered a main line position. But these things can be kind of fun for white. I think these can be very enjoyable, these positions, even though black is perfectly okay. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, and black can also play d4, which is an obvious move because it gains time, and that's perfectly legitimate. Usually white goes here. White has a couple ideas. One idea is to play sort of a King's Indian reversed with here and g3 and bishop there, and either f4 or knight f3, play King's Indian. Another idea is to play knight g3 and then bring this bishop out and play d3. Let me show you that for a second. Say pawn there, knight here. Now a good move for black now is to play this to stop bishop c4, because if black just plays sort of normally, like say here, then maybe white's got what he wants. Not that white's better necessarily, but white's got kind of what he's been aiming for, which is to play for f4 and knight f3 and castles, and play this move d3, but without cutting off that bishop. This bishop is active now, so both white's bishops are active is the idea. And this is a fun position for white. It may not be better, it may not be worse, it's just a position. Black's probably fine, but it's what white was kind of after. That's what white would like to do. So usually black stops that by playing this move bishop e6. And then white can do fancy things like check and come back and try to challenge that bishop. There's all kinds of crazy things. You can just attack the center directly. You can attack the center with that move. It's a fun system for both sides. Interesting line. Comes from the move one knight c3. So yeah, so you can play knight c3 against in the Scandinavian, but don't expect to get an advantage. That's all. You just get a game. You'll never see the dragon. Yeah, good point. Let's get to that dragon. Maybe I'll even do that now because we've got Smyslov defense question. We've got Indiana Jones. Okay, so let's just start now because I'll never get to it. Let me put up a game. A couple weeks ago, Elliot Winslow, a very famous IM who's done tons of stuff in the world of chess, asked about the dragon, and we never really got around to a complete answer from it. Oh, I also have this chess philosopher question. I'll do that. Well, we won't get to it probably, but I'll get to it next week. Oh, that came from last week too. But I'm gonna go directly to this dragon thing, and we won't answer it completely probably. I have three games to possibly show, and I'm sure we won't get to all of them. But I think they're all extremely interesting, and so many young players play the dragon, and so many people play against the dragon that maybe it'll be of interest to people. He asked about, and I don't know much about the dragon, so even though I played it a lot, in the old days, way back when, and I don't have any students that play the dragon as a main line, which is why I probably don't know the dragon that well. But anyway, this is the dragon, as we mentioned, and Elliot asked about, and here's the main line with the Yugoslav attack. So you'll get this position again and again and again as white and black if you play the dragon. And this is the bishop c4 line. We talked about castles being the other popular move, extremely popular move, but this is still very, very important. And so I looked up some of these things. Now I should mention here that h4 right away is also interesting. It discourages what's called the, I'm sorry, let me make one more move here. It discourages what's called the Chinese dragon, and that's just a technical point. But also it discourages the, what do you call it? It discourages the idea of playing this Topalov variation is a little less attractive maybe once h4 is in instead of castles. But that's just technical. But you might want to keep in mind that h4 can lead to separate move orders. Anyway, that wasn't what the question was about. The question was about this position, standard classic position that's occurred in literally hundreds of thousands of master games. That's how important this is. And there was a two-pronged question here about the moves. Bishop g5, Burns' old move. Now there's an old-fashioned move. It's not. It turns out it's not even mentioned in several books. And about king b1, which actually now has become pretty much the most popular move. It's an extremely important move. I think the most dangerous move actually, as opposed to usual things like h4. So let's take those one at a time. In this game, he looked at bishop g5. That's an old move by Robert Byrne. And so what I thought I'd show is the game Byrne-Tarjan to start with. This line is almost never played anymore, but something that's done very well for white is if black plays this move. Now let me just compare. It's going to be kind of obscure, but it turns out this, the Soltis variation, which you may have seen, white often plays here now, and black plays this move rook c5, and it just turns out that these moves actually help black more often than hurt him in a lot of key variations. So just by the dint of long experience, it turns out that this move, it's still played, but hardly ever. It's just not as good in this position. The trade-off of having h5 and h4 is actually good for black, oddly enough, in this position. And you can look up all that theory. So what black usually does, and sometimes black plays queen a5 here. It is played sometimes, but black overwhelmingly plays the move knight c4. And this is what Elliot was asking about. I didn't remember anything about this. And white's main answer now, black's just stands well, basically. White's moved his bishop twice. Why would you want to do that? Well, it's because white's after a central game here. Like, for example, in this position, one of white's ideas would be just to play rook here and f4 and just blast away in the center with e5. He's given up on all the h4, h5, sack mate ideas in the dragon. So what does black do? Well, black just plays naturally in this game. And now, if white plays slowly, black just plays the usual moves. There's b5 ideas, there's queen a5 ideas with the other rook coming over to attack. And white's game is a little too slow. It's a little too slow to go back to try to attack now. So what white plays is this clever little move. This was Byrne's point. And the idea is, well, he pretty much has to take that because it's just too strong a pawn and it's attacking. And you can look at it, but he pretty much has to take that. And then Byrne played that move. And the idea of that move is that this is hanging. You're threatening bishop takes followed by queen takes. But it's also pinned. That piece is pinned. The bishop can't move because of queen takes d8. This is an old line. It's almost never played anymore, but it's actually extremely fascinating. What we'll see, because I'm going to show you two games, is that that's probably a better move. But I found some very interesting things here. Here's what really amazed me about this. First of all, that's played by far, even today, it's played more often than anything else, well, by far. And I looked at correspondence databases because that's a good way to see what's going on in a variation. Like, why wouldn't people be playing this? And in the Dragon, since things are pretty forcing, you'll see that if it's not played in correspondence, there's usually some sort of reason. And it has been played some, but it's had disastrous results. This move, bishop g5, came out absolutely horrible. In the main lines, it had a 400-point performance rating edge for black over 18 games, and many more wins for black than white. So you might think, well, that's just hopeless. But it's not the end of the story at all. And you might even want to consider playing bishop g5, because it turns out that after this move, in spite of results, white has a lot of good chances here and might really want to consider playing this. But anyway, here's the old move. It's played in a vast majority of games. And the answer in this game is, rook c7. Oh yeah, because you got to defend this. And then white can play this move knight b5, because if bishop takes is no good because of queen takes. So it looks like white's winning. Well, white is winning material. The problem with white winning material, though, there's two problems. One is what happens in this game, a counterattack, where you get a bishop pair and a pawn, an extra pawn, fighting against the win of the exchange for white. And notice that this move runs into this with check, and then there's the discovered check, and that's just winning for black. So that's one answer. The other problem, what was I going to say? What's the other move here? Oh, the other thing that black can do here is simply retreat, amazingly enough, surprisingly enough, because after this move, you have bishop takes. And this is actually considered better for black. You're still a pawn ahead, and everything's perfectly fine for black here. So, and after that move, white takes this with tempo, so it looks like it might be good. But black plays here, and now he's on the knight, which is on an open file, and the king's there. And this is all sort of forced. This has been played a lot of times, and white's best move is probably knight up at this point. There are other ways to do this. Here, you might wonder, well, why doesn't he just take this? But then black sneaks away here, and this knight is trapped, because rook here is coming. For example, knight back, rook here, and this knight falls anyway. Anyway, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but this has been well established that black is doing perfectly well here. In fact, I think I'll stop at that point rather than giving you a lot of detail. Quite a few games with this. It's about even if white plays perfectly, but white almost never ends up better. Black wins most of these games. That's one reason these statistics are so skewed. In this game, he didn't even bother with the rook c8 move, which is fine. Rook c8 is maybe even the best move if you want to win. But he plays there. And black's compensation consists of the fact that he has the bishop pair and one pawn for the exchange. That's usually good enough. And Byrne just sort of develops. And black gets that nice attack on the king. White moves to the side. These are all natural moves. Another nice move by black, headed towards the king. And now that very nice move, threatening knight c4. And black's actually better now, because the knight's going to be so strong on c4. Byrne played here. Knight c4. Queen c1. And he saved the bishop. And I think saving the bishop's a really good idea, but he could get a small advantage playing just by taking this, because the knight is so strong on the queen side. So, for example, this move, threatening a4, and if a4, then I think knight takes b2 is going to be good. No, e4, excuse me. e4 is a good move, because this guy's hanging in a lot of variations. For example, if rook takes. But if pawn takes, you have this problem. So it just turns out black has a very nice attack there, and some advantage. But black decided to save the bishop. Why not? To keep attacking. But then the attack didn't get through. So at some point here, black, well, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Black had better moves. This is still pretty good for black, but it turned out that white was able to defend. White just defended very well. This is Robert Byrne, who was in the candidates matches, one of the top players in the world at the time. And he sort of slithered out of everything. I think black's still doing pretty well here, but maybe not anymore. I think somewhere around here. Yeah, it turns out white even had a really strong move here, with ideas of here and covering this if the rook strays because you win the knight. It just turns out this is pretty much a winning move. But, it's chess, and this is real chess, and it was an original position, and every move is complicated, and it's natural to miss stuff like that. So maybe I will stop at this point. White did win the game, but it was very, very messy and very complicated. So I think I'll just leave it at that. Okay, what do we have here? I wonder if I should go back to the chat for a second before I show you the next game, because the next game is much more interesting because it's this knight d2 move. But John, you usually don't want to give up your white squared bishop with white. Yeah, it depends. Depends on the position. In some ways you have to. The dragon is so important because of the king's name occurs in modern thematic transpositions. You don't see the dragon often in Super GM games. Well, yeah, it's true, but on the other hand, look at the number of Super GMs that have played the dragon, including Carlsen and Topalov and Nakamura. I mean, everybody's played it some, so it's still a pretty big opening. Rouser, simple after the dragon is g3. You can certainly do that. You can play g3 against the dragon. Sack made the Fischer quote. Yeah, nobody seems to be able to do that in the dragon anymore. So Fischer was a little bit optimistic. This position is so hard. Yeah, these are hard positions. Recent interest in the dragon with a6. Sure, I mean, that's what Carlsen played, for example. He played the Dragdorf. It's called the Dragdorf with a6. He's talking about, I might as well show you that. But let me put the new game up. We'll get one more game in. I'm really kind of determined to show you this because we keep stalling on it. And I think it's fascinating. And here's a weapon that white could possibly use, too, which I think is interesting, and yet black needs to know about. So it's a great combination. And then next week we'll look at king b1, Elliot's other question. But this move, bishop g5, is very obscure. And the books I looked at don't even cover it. Gowan Jones does, and I'll tell you what he says. Most people just don't seem to even talk about the bishop g5 at all. So that's kind of fascinating, that the move's so out of favor, and yet it's quite a decent move. And it's a little frustrating for black because there's quite a few lines where I don't think black can do better than, black's almost forced into a drawish position. And dragon players would like to have winning chances at least. So there we are with bishop g5 again. Now the question was, let me talk about the Dragdorf. The Dragdorf is where you'd play a6 instead of knight c6. And one of the ideas is you're going to play b5, so you're just going to play normal attacking Sicilian kind of moves. But one of the ideas is this knight may end up going like that, or even like that to b6 after b5. In other words, some position like this, you might end up bringing the knight to cover the c4 square, or even knight e5, or maybe knight c5. And you might want to play b4, obviously. Anyway, it's a different way of attacking. It's an English opening reversed. And in fact, white might not castle, and that's one of the issues. But if he does, this is the thing. That's called the Dragdorf. I don't know what its theoretical status is right now. It's an English opening reverse. I'd rather be probably white there, just because I know those lines pretty well with reverse colors. Sicilian, Carol, French. What's the best choice? It's a pretty broad question, but we'll talk about that next week. I'll try and give some general thing. Looks like black has 11 pawns on the king's side. Okay, hey, perfect. So we actually can go over this right now. I don't think I skipped anything too important yet. I'll get back to any other questions, but I want to finish this one first. Okay, so this game is Ruiz Aguilar versus B.E. Gonzalez. So one of the Gonzaleses, of the hundreds of Gonzaleses, whose name starts with B.E. I'm not sure what his first name is. I should have probably looked it up. Okay, so we're back in this line. We're back at that key position with knight e5. Now here again, Elliot asked about bishop g5 and king b1. King b1 is very popular right now, and we're going to look at a game next week with that. But let's take a look at this. Yeah, I wanted to show you that this rook c5 move. Yeah, here's an example. Rook he1, I think is the best move, with the idea of going here and here. And if you play f4 immediately, it's not so clear. Because, and let me see if I can show you this. One funny idea is this move, but then after this it gets, probably in the end it's good for black, even though black can try rook takes c3 there. So the main thing is, actually, this is my fault. Oh, I see. No, this is okay to play knight c6. Okay, knight c6, e5, and rook c3 is playable here. You've got this idea of knight e4 for one thing. Turns out black has no other move besides rook c3. if takes, then here, and you're still on that, so that's okay for black too. Let me see if I can show you. There was one game with these two moves and black played here, and this is considered about equal. It's just a complicated position. So white can play this way. What black really can't do is play very naturally here after f4 and play knight c4. It looks totally harmless, but in fact e5 is really strong here. There's just no way to really meet this properly, and you can look at that for a while, but you can kind of see why. White's just sort of smashing through here. There's just no good way to play without leaving a lot of things hanging. There's even e6 themes sometimes. So, and also if the knight moves, you have to be careful here because that move, that pawn is pinned. So there's a big threat of taking and that sort of thing. This all comes out to be in white's favor. So just to show you that idea. So you should play knight c6 here as black. And white might think about playing here before he plays f4. And I think white can be very happy with these positions. I think white's slightly better in these positions. It's a central strategy. You're not trying to sack mate, you're just trying to blow them away in the center, which is kind of fun. So the main move is this move, as we mentioned last game. And this move for white, because otherwise black's just very happy to have gotten rid of white's bishop, which someone mentioned there, getting rid of your light square bishop. So white has to be dramatic here, otherwise black just has two bishops in a nice typical dragon position. But this is all threats. He's threatening to win a piece. So he's really forcing matters. And last game we saw this, and black was fine after this move. And after knight b5, he could have gone back. Rook c8 was just fine. Or he can do what he did in the game, which is this bishop f5 move. Wait, was it now? Yeah, bishop f5 now. But in this game, white plays this move. And Gawain Jones, to his credit, one of the few people that talks about this line in his dragon book. I looked at a lot of dragon books. I mean, they talk about it, but without really incorrectly and very briefly, and hardly anybody mentions this move. I give that an exclamation point because now you have the same threat of taking here, but there's no. But this is supporting the king side. There's no knight hanging on b5. It just turns out this is quite an interesting move to play. It would be very frustrating for a dragon player because I think a draw is the best you're going to get in most cases here. So this is worth, I think, showing. So now rook c7 I think is forced because you've got to defend your piece. There's a piece hanging. And then in this game he plays simply takes. Now there's two moves here, and Gawain Jones says they're both okay for black, and I guess I agree with him. They're okay, but they really just aren't ideal. You're taking either way. Let me show you. The most common move is here. He kind of prefers this, and I think he might be right, or maybe he doesn't prefer it, but he says it's possibly the best move. He says it may be the better move. Okay, white plays this move, attacking this, and if the rook moves, he's going to play check and queen takes, just winning a piece. So that looks like a nice move, but as in the other position, we have that move. Counterattacking with rook c2. So this check no longer wins the game because of this check. And then black gets another discovered check and can just take his queen back, or there might be other ways to play it too, I'm not sure. But in any case, black's going to be ahead materially here. So that doesn't work. So what white plays here after bishop takes is knight c7. And here, and this is a little different this time because white's knights are coordinating very well here, and this bishop maybe isn't that great a piece there because you have knight e5 or knight e4 at some point. So supposedly this is equal, and maybe it's equal, but I think the main line he gives is e4. I think it's the best move. Otherwise, I think that white's just a little better. Now, normally a bishop pair is good enough with an extra pawn to be worth an exchange. In other words, a rook. Two bishops are worth a knight and a rook. If two bishops and a pawn are worth a knight and a rook. Here I think white's a little better, just because of the specifics of the position. But that's a good try to equalize. That's a good try to get back, and that's what he recommends. And some other, I think it's mentioned some other places too. I like playing knight d5 here, and then e3 is the main move, because otherwise white simply takes and plays things like queen d5. It depends where this knight goes, but it's looking pretty good. And then white takes that with the knight. Black pins it, and I have white just playing here. Gawain Jones mentions rook here. But the main point is that you're just going to play c3. Whoop. Sorry. Oh no, here you would take that, so the bishop has to come back. And then you just play the c3 move. You play rook he1 and c3. So this position is, and I have some analysis of this, but I think basically Yeah, my fault. I play c3 first, I think. Yeah, I was playing c3 first here. Oh. How does that work? Oh yeah, okay. So everything's protected, and I went. There's a lot of detail you can go into in positions like this, but I think in the end, even though black sometimes would win an extra pawn, white would have big centralized position and do really well. So you can look at this, but I would recommend looking at this because I think only white. There's even a game with this. Let me see. Rook he1. That's the rook he1. Sorry. I think c3 first is slightly more accurate, but it's almost the same thing. Okay, here c3. Bishop e6, king b1, and he says equal here, queen h2, and he gives a line with g4. And you just have to analyze this, but the material's not that bad, but white's well centralized, and in the end I just kind of like white in this position. I think it just works out better. The rooks are nice in the end. It's not so bad with rooks in the ending, when the queens are off. And if the queens don't go off, then white has some nice initiative, or can get some nice initiative. So, hard to say. I mean, if I look at this, when I first looked at it, I thought, oh yeah, this is probably equal. There's something about having the bishop here. But I think in reality, you might want to play this as white. And you certainly, the problem with black is you're just never going to win that against a good player. So it's sort of like one of those practical positions that I think is very interesting for white. Also, black has to know all this and play it correctly. I think that e4 move is very kind of subtle. Okay, so what was that all about? Oh, the game itself. Let me see, is there a game itself? Oh, the game itself was e takes f, which has actually been played the most often. That's the most common move. And then knight there, winning the exchange. Bishop f5, this time is pretty much forced, I think. Although actually, black has played rook c5 here, with the idea of counterattacking here, and then I think this move knight ec3, yeah. This position has been played. And it just turns out here that white's got, this extra pawn, he has an attack on that, and even though it's still maybe playable, you'd rather be white here. You're going to end up with probably a small material advantage. But it's really undesirable. So the main line by far is this, giving up the exchange again. And white plays there. And black plays here. But you see what I mean? It's not like black has that many pieces left. And now I think the best move, the game, I'm going to skip the game because time. We're going to run out of time. But let me just show you what I think the main line is. And Gowon-Jones gives this. I'm sorry. The main line is queen d6. And captures back. And then this is a very good move for black because if he takes it, the rook is trapped. Now he gives the move rook d5. And I think white comes out better in this position too. It's something like here and rook here. It's a small advantage, but it's a little something. He says it's a complicated ending, but I think it's a better ending for white. He stops there. Now normally I would say, okay, this is equal. I'm a big fan of two bishops, and you have an extra pawn. You have sort of a pawn mass. I think what you find in these positions though is these double pawns actually do hurt black a little because they mean that this pawn mass is hard to advance. The only way to really see that is by now you're threatening knight d6 in a lot of cases, is by going over the lines, by just looking at the lines. But I think you'll find that white actually has better winning chances than black. For example, if black tries to activate his pieces here, it's actually hard to get these guys really moving. Even with the move g5, it's hard to end with the king coming up because these pawns are not really coordinating very well. The double pawns don't really help black. So I kind of changed my mind about this position as I was looking at it. I decided I'd prefer to be white here. But whether it's enough to win now, that's a whole different thing. Anyway, I thought people might be interested in that, using that system for white. And maybe I'll just stop there, because otherwise we're going to get way too crazy. And then next week I'll show you a king b1 line. So let me get back to the chat, see if there's a few last minute questions that are easy to answer. And then I'll bid you guys farewell till next week. But I just wanted to show that dragon stuff. The dragon is really fun from both sides, but there's always this question about what to do as white. Isn't queen a5 stronger? Okay, where though is the question. Threatening mate on a2. Oh, okay, let's go back. Let's go back. I think there's no real chance to do that. Must have been when the king was on b1. Uh-oh. Which line? Oh, maybe you can tell me which line. this is my fault. If I noticed this faster, I would have known which line we were talking about. You can always go back to this and just put it on an engine or put it on the board, and I think you'll see what's going on with Queen A5. Wondering if you're thinking... No, because that would be an A2 mate. There was one line where the king was here, and there was a Queen A2 idea. And my apologies, because I wish I'd gotten that right right at the position. Maybe I'll look at next week and see where Queen A5 would be good. But I think the answer is no, it's not stronger if you're careful as white. Because I did put this all in the engine, and I did look at every move, and I think you'll find that these are fairly... And also, it turns out that Gowan Jones agrees that this is the lines I just showed are really the most important lines for black, the best lines. So I don't think there was ever a really handy place to play Queen A5. And I'm sorry I can't answer that more specifically. What else do we have here? We have... I'm going to go back and see what I skipped that might have been halfway, that might be easy to answer fairly quickly. Yes, Happy New Year, everybody. That's important. We need a new year. Last year was depressing. Okay. Oh, Eric again. He says also he wrote a book on the Smyslov defense. Okay, we can take a quick look at that. Smyslov defense is kind of fun. It's kind of like a Schlechter Slav, but not quite. This is the Smyslov defense of the Queen's Gambit. That's right. Okay, so takes. That's the Queen's Gambit accepted. And then if white plays e3, playing g6. Okay. So you guys might want to look at this. I think Eric, if I'm right, Eric, I don't know if you're still listening, but I think he updated the this version. I think I saw his updated version of this. Like he just rewrote. It's an older book, and he wrote it again with updated analysis. And one thing about an opening like this is very solid for black. It's hard to get checkmated. It's just very, very solid kind of position, and that's always nice, right? It's hard to break down. On the other hand, white has a central majority and more space, so I certainly wouldn't mind being white here. But it is worth noticing that you can play openings like this where at least you aren't going to get attacked. You're very safe. You're not going to get blown off the board in a position like this because this is such a solid defensive position. But you are lacking a little bit of space, and you're lacking, and white has that central majority. So I tend to prefer white, but it's just he's got a whole book to try and prove otherwise. So, so we can have fun with that. Okay, any relationship to the late Herb Schiller? Don't know. Wonder if he answered that. Looks like Elyakin reverse d4. Yeah, it is kind of like the d4 line I showed you was kind of with knight e4. It was kind of like the knights jumping around. I'm going back, just checking out the comments before I say goodbye for today. Eric mentioned g3 against the dragon. It's a very easy line to play. Recent interest in Dragoness at Dragdorf, that's true. Oh, I should have mentioned the other line against the dragon, though. This will be the last thing I say, but last week I mentioned this line, and this has been the most popular for a couple of years, although just recently I think black's trying to find some other lines too. But in this position, I'll get this. This idea, playing knight takes, and I mentioned this last week, so you can go back and look at that, but this idea, the Bulgarian variation, I think it's called, because Topalov played it, is a fair amount of fun. And if white tries to checkmate black by just sort of throwing everything up like that, it turns out black's doing pretty well. I know my friend Keaton Kira has played this as black and has a really nice game, with some published games that worked out well. I think the real key is what happens when white plays in the center with that kind of move. And even that might be equal or even, very, very slightly better for white. But as far as I know, this is all still playable for black. So if you want a pretty safe line, that's pretty interesting. But you do have to study this and make sure you don't get checkmated. You have to kind of memorize some lines. But this is worth knowing, this variation, as black, if you're interested in playing something. And a lot of very top players have played this. Someone was asking about elite players playing the dragon. Well, a whole bunch of them played this line. I think, I'm trying to remember. Well, obviously Topalov, who was number 2 in the world even last year briefly, and has been world champion, played it. But a bunch of other players at the very top have played this. Thinking Vashir Legrave, who is a Najdorf player, but he may have thrown in this dragon once. Maybe Nakamura. Can't remember for sure, but I think several people have played this variation. Well, I know they have because I've seen lists of in books of people who've played this, and it's a pretty impressive list. Okay, so thank you everybody. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't bore you and not get to enough chat questions, but I really want to show you that dragon stuff because it's such a common thing for young people to play, and I still think it's playable for black, and I also think it's playable for white. So we'll look at one more of those next week. And he's talking about Eric's, okay, last comments here about Eric's books on the Catalan and unusual openings. So, yeah, and there's the question, why don't Super GMs play the dragon anymore? I think you'll find they kind of do. You've got to remember, right now, they're almost all playing E4, E5, so these things are fashion. They go in cycles. Really, E4, E5, and the Najdorf, right? But Super GMs have played everything at one point or another in their careers, and they'll play everything again once whatever they're playing now becomes less fashionable. So don't worry about, these things always survive, and I think you'll find that the dragon will be played, a fair amount still in chess. It's just not the main line. I think white gets some very tiny positional advantages sometimes that black's not really happy with. Okay, everybody, thanks very much, and I hope that you'll tune in again next week. Happy New Year.